I think this is correct. Can you see that okay?
Yes, sir. Now
Yes. And how is the volume is good for you? You can hear me?
good, sir.
Okay. So tell me when you want me to start.
Okay, sir. You are online. We transfer to online. You had the permission to start, sir. You can start now.
I can start. Okay. Well, I can't see any of my audience, but Kocaeli Üniversitesi'ne çok teşekkür etmek isterim. And I'm going to be talking about the unexplained persistence of international inequality and its relation to the long-standing subject of development. So the last time I spoke on any question like this nature in Turkey was at Middle East Technical University in Ankara. And this was on the 11th of September, 2001. And in this paper that I gave at that time, which you can see on my website, I predicted that we were entering a new stage of the world which would be dominated by war. And after I had given my talk, I was supposed to be interviewed by Turkish television, but in fact, they simply took me into the television van, and for the next 8 hours, I watched the fall of the Twin Towers, because my lecture was given at the same time as that terrible and tragic event. So this is of great importance, the issue of international inequality and development, because it affects so many aspects of our lives. Now, I'm going to be talking about what I'm calling the new inequality literature. There's been, in recent years, it probably started, back in the 1980s with the work of the World Bank, but there's been a new flourishing of new ideas about inequality. And I'm going to take a critical look at those ideas. There are 4 concepts of inequality I'm going to think about. The first is what I call 2 within nation inequality concepts. And these are the new literature. We have Piketty and his team, and their work is very well known. They've produced a lot of excellent data. However, it only deals with what's happening inside each nation. They do not discuss what is happening between nations. So when they say one nation is more unequal than another, they do not mean that that nation is richer or poorer than the other nation. They only mean that inequality within that nation is higher. And the second concept is that of Milanovic, who works with the so-called Household Poverty Project in the World Bank, or related to the World Bank. And he has this idea that though one should study inequality between nations, this is outmoded. And he actually says the concept is history, because what you should study is inequality between all households over the whole world without paying any attention to nations whatsoever. But there are actually 2 prior concepts of inequality. The first was a very famous paper by Lance Pritchett in Economic Perspectives called Divergence Big Time, in which he pointed out that the gap between the richest and poorest nations was not, as was expected, getting smaller, but was getting larger. And this was contrary to what economic theory predicted, because it predicted that the poor nations over time would catch up, and international trade theory tells you that the disparities between nations would disappear. And Pritchett simply said, it's getting bigger. There's a prior tradition even to that, and this is Kuznets, who I think is really the person that I'm referring myself to in all this work. And Kuznets studied inter-block inequality, divided the world into 3 blocks, the rich, the poor, and the Soviet bloc at that time. And he studied the relations between those 3 blocks. And I think that that is a lost tradition which needs to be restored, and that's what I'm going to try and do. However, what's the reason for it? First of all, it explains the other inequalities. So everything that Piketty and Milanovic are studying can be shown, or a large part of it, to be caused by inequality between blocks. However, you have to get the blocks right. You have to define your blocks so it shows how these causal effects work. And I think the problem is that the main providers of data, the United Nations, the World Bank, and the IMF, don't get the blocks right. So that's what I'm basically going to be saying. Now, I'm going to start with a very simple measure of inequality. You take the GDP per capita of what I'm going to call the global north, and it's what's normally called the global north. It's Europe, America, Japan, the settler colonies. And you divide it by the GDP of the global south. Although, and I'll explain this as we get into the discussion, I'm going to leave China out of that for very important reasons, because it's an exceptional new historical development. If you make that and you divide the GDP per capita of the north by the south, you get a measure of inequality. How much richer on average are the citizens of the north than the citizens of the south? And this is quite a startling graph, because contrary to what everybody seems to believe, inequality has actually been systematically increasing right up to the year 2000. In the year 2000, it started to go down again, but it's still double what it was in 1950. Even more striking is that although it leveled out a bit during what were called the development decades, the developments in which, periods in which people focused on measures to strengthen their own internal economies, the countries of the global south, when you got deregulation, the debt crisis, and neoliberalism, it shot up, and it reached a historic peak of nearly 22 times. So the average citizen of the north was 22 times better off than the average citizen of the south. So this is quite striking, and it doesn't figure in anything you get from any of the data providers, and I'm going to be looking into that. There is one exception, which I'll come back to, but it's not my main purpose to talk about it, which is China. And from about 1990 onwards, it's systematically improved relative to the north, so that it was actually terribly badly off in 1990, 60 times poorer than the global north on average. It's now 5 times poorer. So it's, in my opinion, breaking out of the historical fate of the rest of the South. That's why I call it the exception that proves the rule. It's not following the same policies as the rest of the global South. It doesn't follow the Washington consensus, and it's showing a different pattern. So we leave it out in order to make the interblock comparisons that I'm going to be talking about. Now, the first thing is to look at other possible measures of international inequality. And there are 2 measures that are favored. There's the one that Milanovic mainly uses, which is the Genie. And he has 2 Genie measures. One he calls Concept 2 Genie, where you just look at the nations without taking into account their size. And then it's Concept 1. Concept 2 Genie is when you weight the different countries by their population. So in this graph here that we've got, I'm just looking at the Genie index, the unweighted Genie index. And there's a very striking parallel that basically the Genie index is more or less predicted by interblock inequality. And there's no obvious reason that should be. Why should? They're 2 different things. We're measuring on the one hand the inequality between 2 blocks of nations, on the other hand the Genie between all nations. Why should there be any connection between the 2? So my hypothesis is because the interblock inequality dominates all other effects, and that means that we've got to suspect there's a causal explanation going on here. And just to take a look at the second measure that is used by Milanovic, it applies also to this little pink one here is the weighted Genie. The correspondence is not so visually obvious, but over here we have regressions. And you can see the R squared, this is predicting the Genie using interblock inequality, is very high. And the probability that this could happen by accident is kind of nanoscale, e to the -72. So there's pretty likely to be some sort of connection there. We can go further using something called the TILE index, T-H-E-I-L. Now, the nice thing about the tile index is it allows you to disaggregate the contributions from inequality from different sources. So the red block here is the total tile index. This is a stacked graph. So there's total tile index, total tile index is this red line at the top. And everything in red is the contribution of interblock inequality. This one down at the bottom is the contribution of inequality between the nations of the South. This is the contribution of inequality between the nations of the North. And there's a tiny little band here, you can hardly see it, which is the transitional bloc countries. Now you can see here that the interblock inequality completely dominates over all the others when it comes to accounting for inequality between nations. Interestingly enough also, and I'm going to come back to that, if you look at the way this yellow line that does international inequality within the North, you can see it shrinking. The North is actually converging, contrary to what people think. And I'm going to come back to that because it's a rather significant fact. And in fact, I'm also going to show that the South is converging. So you've got two blocks, each of them is converging within itself, but they're diverging from each other. Now, in looking at this, the question of scale is formidably important. When Pritchett wrote his famous paper, the richest country in the world was 202 times wealthier than the poorest in current US dollars. 20 years later, the richest, Luxembourg, was 1,000 times better off than the poorest, which was Somalia. So in 20 years, the gap between the richest and the poorest country grew by 5 times. And is huge, at 1,000 times richer, dwarfs anything that's happening inside those countries. And if you look at the interblock differential, the graph that I showed you earlier, the smallest differential was when the North was 6 times as rich as the South. This rose to 10 times by the time the development decades began. And then when neoliberalism set in, it rose to a peak of 22 times greater. It was restored somewhat during the commodity price boom of 2000 to 2012, although that's leveled out a bit, but it was still 12 times bigger, which is historically higher than at any time since the start of the debt crisis. So what does this imply? What are the consequences of that? Well, let's start looking at the relation between international inequality and within nation inequality. So here we have a quite complex chart, but let me talk you through it. These 4 columns here are the quartiles, the average income of the quartiles of the North. So the average income of the poorest quartile of the North is $30,532, and of the richest is $60,000. So you could say, look, it's a pretty unequal country. The top quartile is twice as badly off as the bottom quartile. Within the South as the South as a whole. I beg your pardon. That's within the USA. That's within the USA. Those quartiles, and the USA is thought of as a fairly unequal country. These are the quartiles of the South. These little white ones here, and inequality is actually much greater within the South, but not as great as you might think. So the richest quartile is, about 8 times richer than the poorest quartile. Although, if you look at quartile 3, it's actually only twice as big as that. So there's an elite here in the top quartile, and we're going to come and look at that in a bit. Now, the key thing here is the difference between the highest quartile, the lowest quartile of the North, and the highest quartile of the South. So the average income of the poorest people in the USA is actually 4 times, nearly 5 times that of the richest quartile of the South. So that gap is actually twice as big as the gap between the richest quartile of the North and the poorest quartile of the South, and twice as big as that between, of the North, twice as big as the gap between quartile 3 and quartile 1 of the South. So it dwarfs everything else. And it's actually the biggest source I would hypothesize, and I think this can be proven, of inequality within nations. Why? Because the low wages of the South act as a constant downward pressure on the wages of the North, because obviously firms just migrate, they outsource, or people are frightened that they're going to outsource, and so they accept lower wages. And there's immigration has some effect, although not as much as racist narratives would claim. And the elites of the South, and this is probably the biggest effect, essentially aspire to have incomes as high as the average income of the North, which is much higher than the poor people of the South. And that's one of the reasons there is such chaos and turmoil in the South, because the elites have a very narrow social base. There's just not enough people of an income that they aspire to keep them in power, which is why there's constant, political turmoil and difficulties in those countries. So there's a connection between interblock, international inequality and within nation inequality. And again, you can look at this by considering two possible policies. One policy might be, we're going to eliminate inequality within the South without changing the average income of the South. We're just going to do what Piketty says, make everybody more equal in each country. But there's another strategy, which is to development. You raise the average income of the South up to the level of the North without changing the distribution in the South. So this sort of shift share thing, there's two possible things you can do. Let's look at what would be the result of each one if it was isolated from the others. Well, the first policy cannot eliminate global inequality. If you take 2014 as a benchmark year, just because that's the year in which I have good data for every country, if you did measure one, everybody in the South would be earning $3,339. That's the average income of the South in that year. The average income of the North was $45,639. So the average income, everybody in the South would be earning 1/11 of the average income of the North. And they would be earning 1/9 of the worst off quartile, which had, you remember, an average income of $30,532. The population weighted Genie would fall from 64 to 57. This is in terms of international inequality. So it's Milanovich's concept 2, and his concept 1 Genie actually rises if you take that measure, which is an extraordinary result. So that's the best you can do by addressing within nation inequality only, without addressing between nation inequality. And we should also note that if we took this step, and we did it both in the North and the South, there would be no difference between Milanovich's concept 2 and concept 3 inequality, because there'd be, all households would be the same. So we eradicate that difference, and we still find that concept 3 inequality and concept 2 inequality predict the same thing, which is you're going to be a damn sight worse off in the South than in the North, unless you do something about the gap between the North and the South. So what would happen if you bring the South's average income up to that of the North? So no internal distribution, just raise the income of every Southern nation by a factor of 11.61. Not even redistribution between the nations of the North. Just make everybody in the block 11 times better off than they were before. You would then equalize the average Southern and Northern income. The weighted Genie then falls to 43, which is I think about 13 percentage point or 13 Genie points, and the unweighted 1 to 40. Even the worst off quartile of the South would be in striking distance of its counterpart in the North, and the second worst off quartile of the South would rise to between the bottom and the third quartile of the North. And you still have room to make great substantial improvements by quite minor redistributive measures within each nation and between the nations of each bloc. So why isn't this accepted? The general atmosphere in the nations of the global North is that they are very frightened that the South will catch up. I think that's a big part of the hostility to China that one finds in the world today. I mean, certainly from Trump. When he says that they're robbing us, what he really means is they're catching up with us. And why? Well, they think it's going to make them worse off. I'm sure they believe that, but it's wrong. It's irrational. Why? Because the only way the South can catch up is by becoming more productive. But if it does that, what does more productive mean? It means you produce more for the same money. So the price of all goods in the world would fall down. They would collapse. When I say collapse, I just mean there would be a very significant reduction in prices. So the purchasing power of the North would rise. If you had the same money income, you wouldn't be worse off because of cheaper goods. You'd be better off because you'd be able to buy everything for a fraction of what you could buy it for before. And if the wages of the South were to rise, they would stop exerting downward pressure on the wages of the North. So it's a very irrational thing to be opposed to development or to be scared of development, or not to focus on development as a primary objective of the economic welfare of the whole planet, and not just something you do for the poor people of the South. It would benefit the North. And the only losers would be, and I think this is where we get a clue to why the hostility of the North is so pronounced, is where the North has a de facto monopoly. Its high-tech sectors, to some extent, its extractive sector, its finance sector, they would lose that monopoly. And the profits of the monopoly high-tech companies and extractive companies and banking companies of the North, they would fall. But that's a question of rebalancing. It's a question, for example, of starting new green technologies with all the money that you're now spending, paying very high prices for high-tech goods. And precisely because the price of those high-tech goods would be falling, green technology would be much cheaper. So you can also save the planet. So the resistance is very irrational and comes, I would surmise, from a relatively small group within the global North that unfortunately has captured the narrative and captured the attention and captured the beliefs of the population of the global North. So why don't people understand that? Why don't the statistical agencies say, look, this is what's going on in the world, and this is the rational thing to do? Well, I want to argue that one of the most important things is the choice of block. I think the prime reason that it's simply not visible in the data is what I'm reporting here, global South and global North. You won't find that in the United Nations or the World Bank or the IMF. It's simply not there. They don't produce figures on it. Now, I'm working with the data laboratory of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba. I recommend you all to visit the Geopolitical Economy website and see the stuff that we're working on. And I'd be very happy for people to join us in this data project. It's an open access data project. And all we've done is put all the data from these providers together in one place in a big database and allowed people to define their own blocks. So you can check out what I'm saying. You can say, well, I don't really agree with Professor Freeman. I'd rather have a different choice of blocks. Fine, try it. We've set up a laboratory where you can do that. Now, the first category that we find from these providers is what I would call geoeconomic blocks. So they construct blocks like East Asia or Europe. Well, East Asia, well, first of all, just make a basic point. If we were to put all the countries of the world and shake them up in a bag, pick one at a time and put them in two random blocks, there would be no interblock differences because there'd be an equal admixture of northern and southern countries in each block. So you have to be very careful to choose your blocks so they really represent what's going on, or by the laws of statistics, you won't see it. Well, in the East Asian bloc, which people talk about and say, oh, everything's going good in East Asia, there's actually two completely different blocks of countries. There's the East Asia of the global North, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore. They had a population of 184 million and a GDP per capita of $35,570 in, I think this is 2016, this number. But these countries here, Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Thailand, they have a population 3 times bigger, 580 million people, and their GDP per capita is 1/9. If you mix those up together, what you get is a fictitious average. You have an average income of 11,648. But no country in this group has that average income. It doesn't give you any guide to the way that these countries are actually performing or how the people in them live. So the choice of blocks is very important. Now, I'm sorry, I realize now that I've only just shown you the slide that I've been talking about. So these are the numbers, but you can put the slides and the presentation together later in the privacy of your own home. But I'm now going to move on to look at the GDP per capita of the regions of the South when we take out the global North. So when we speak of East Asia, we only speak of the East Asia of the global South. When we speak of Europe, we only speak of the Europe of the South. And actually include Europe in here, but it's very interesting when you look at the Eastern Europe and the difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So this is the global South, but it's geographical blocks within it. And we take each of these and we say, how much better off is it than the South as a whole? How close is it to the average Southern income? And actually, they're all pretty close. The two top blocks, which is Latin America and the Caribbean on the one hand, and the so-called Middle East and North Africa on the other, they're about between 2.5, between 2 and 3 times better off than the Southern average. All the rest are between 0.5 and 1.5 times better off. The gap between those, between 1 and 2.5, is 1/4 of the gap between the North as a whole and the South as a whole. So that suggests that the interblock differences are, again, bigger, not only than the differences between nations, but the difference between geoeconomic or geographical blocks. So what do the data providers themselves do? And this is actually rather interesting. And I want to take a quite close look at that. They don't provide a North-South division. Kuznets is not there. The IMF provides a definition that you might recognize as the North. It's so-called advanced economies, but it subdivides the rest into a blend of development and geographical categories, such as emerging, developing Europe. You know, how long has it been emerging? How long has it been developing? Well, its income, its average income of Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, or former Czechoslovakia, shows no sign of rising relative to the rest of Western Europe. But you don't see that if you put those two together. Middle East, North Africa, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Can you believe that that's a block? Why? What the rationale for that is, I have no idea. The World Bank makes no attempt to classify countries by their relation to each other. And this is critical because the interblock relation is the relation between two groups of countries who have an economic relation to each other. Trading relation, political relation, financial relation, and many would argue a relation of unequal exchange, which is one of the ways you can account for what's going on here. So the World Bank just falls back on what I would call Weberian characters. They just say rich, poor, middle. I mean, I won't go into why that is a particularly useless way to classify people, except to say what you get is a moving target, because if anything changes, the middle moves. So you can't deduce anything with those kind of categories. Or they use purely instrumental terms like poor and indebted. What about the United Nations, which in other respects leads the way in terms of its standards of statistics, and I think has raised the floor for a lot of the providers of data. When it comes to block divisions, block descriptions, it's very sad. If you look at the Millennium Development Goals, which is the only place that the United Nations actually classifies countries into developing, so well, it should be. It's the development goals. You can't say what development means. Not much point in having goals for it. But the developed countries include Albania, all of former Yugoslavia, all former USSR, all former Eastern Bloc countries. They're all developed, but it excludes South Korea and Singapore. This is simply irrational. It's not going to tell us anything. And they have no definition of development, which I find extraordinary. I think it's like taking an exam where nobody marks the papers. If you don't know when a nation's developed, what's the point in having goals to develop it? And the only clue we get is a marvelous document, which is buried deep in a 2020 United Nations document, which lists 66 developed regions. The only definition of development that the United Nations offers, and these include the Holy See, the Vatican, 5 landlocked European states, 11 non-national islands, of which 6 have fewer than 10,000 inhabitants, and one of them, Heard Island, is actually uninhabited. How you can be developed when you're uninhabited, I have no idea whatsoever. It includes the Russian Federation, but it misses out 35 of the World Bank's 81 high-income countries and 5 of the IMF's advanced countries. And then it goes on basically to throw its hands up and say, we give up. Because it's obviously what was going on. There was a big political battle in the United Nations because nobody wants to be defined as underdeveloped, right? And it says there's no established convention for the designation of developed and developing countries in the United Nations system. There's just a common practice. Well, maybe the United Nations should develop a little bit of work into deciding where the common practice makes sense. Because what everybody actually does is they say, well, you know, there's this bunch of rich countries and this bunch of poor countries. The rich countries have been rich since 1905, and very few people have joined them. And the rest of them, except for China, have been poor since 1905, and they're getting poorer. So, okay, what should our criteria be? Well, the first one is historical. I think that's rather important. How did the nations of the world come into being? And another historical one is change. Has the world economic system changed in a way such that inequality between blocks, compared with 1905 or 1950 or whenever you like, has altered significantly? Well, yes, there is. It's got worse. We're actually now more divergent than in the colonial era, which is something that should give one pause for thought. The next one is coherence. Does each block have distinct characteristics as defined by the nations within it? And then convergence and divergence. Do the nations of each block converge with each other or with the nations of a different block? Now, I'll just quickly, again, check the time that I have and make sure I'm not going to overrun. I've been going for 30 minutes and I think I'll take about 5 minutes more. So I'm going to go quite fast so there's time for questions. First point is the North is historically and economically coherent. There's the definition of it, which I gave earlier. And this is its Lorentz curve. And for those of you who know it, that shows a pretty flat distribution of income. So there's not much inequality within the North, whatever people think. And in fact, it's also converging. These are the Genie and Tile coefficients of just the northern nations. And that has been falling. It fell certainly till about the year 2000, and now it's bumping along and it's flat. And it's much smaller than interblock differentials. So what about the South? Now, the thing that I think confuses people about the South is that they take a number of rather exceptional cases, they seize on those and they say, ha, the South is not coherent. Well, we've already looked at China, and I haven't got the time to go into it, but there's only one country that seems to be historically performing in a similar way to China, and that's Vietnam, but it started from a lower base. So that's an exception which proves the rule, because it's not behaving like the others. Fine. Like a good data scientist, we say, that's different. We'll take it out and we'll make it a separate block. There's also a case for the separate treatment of transitional economies because the data is so different and because they went through a change in the middle of the period that we're looking at, which is the whole historical span from 1950 to the present day. So I have left that out of the calculations that you've seen. But the real problem is the small number of very rich states within the global South. So this is a list of the top, I think it's the top 12, it says top 10 here, but that's not true, countries in the global South by my definition. My definition is everybody who's not in the global North and who's not China and is not transitional. That's my, it's a definition by elimination, but it makes sense. You then have these countries who have a very high GDP per capita, but tiny populations, tiny. The only one that has anything like a normal population that we associate with a nation is Saudi Arabia. So if you look now at the maximum, which is this, and the quartiles of these, of the South as a whole, you find the maximum is you know, 5 times higher than the top quartile because of this small group of countries. Well, what are they? Well, I'm sorry, but they're either oil wells with borders around them, or they're tax havens, or they're luxury tourist destinations, or they're all three. There are exceptions, which are essentially, I would call them enclaves of the North within the South. Now, how can we deal with that? I have not dealt with that by removing them from the calculation, because to do so lays you open, and I think it's statistically suspect. If you start doing things like Windsorizing, where you exclude outliers just because they don't conform your hypothesis, you're basically manipulating the data in order to get the conclusion that you want. So I'm keeping them in because you still get the same conclusion. What should we do is choose the indicators that really show what's going on. Now here, if you look at the Genie, that's this one, the top one, it's quite high. Remember, the Genie for the international inequality at the North was about 0.2, so it's 3 times bigger. But if you take concept 2 Genie and you use population weight, it's much lower. And that's of course because the nations that push this Genie up are that small group of 10 to 15 very rich but tiny countries. And if you remove the enclaves altogether, you get an even lower figure. But it shows it's, Genie 2 concept is not a bad indicator. So not removing them, provided we're careful with the indicators, isn't so bad. But the key thing is we have to use indicators that are not susceptible to the impact of outliers. So I've calculated here weighted interquartile range. That's the 3rd quartile minus the 4th quartile divided by the middle quartile. And that's a very good indicator of coherence. And it's not only coherent with an interquartile range of about 2.5 in 1970, it's converging. So it meets my final criterion. There's coherence and convergence and historical continuity. Now, in the home straight now, there's a paradox. How is it that the South is losing in monetary terms if it's doing what appears to be better and better in terms of real income or PPP, which is actually just another measure of real income? Now, I've used monetary measures throughout. Why? Because money is what you use to buy things. There's no bank in the world will accept a PPP dollar denominated banknote. You can't go in and buy a computer with a PPP. But what you can do is look at real growth and PPP and not say PPP is better and therefore we're going to ignore monetary growth. And I'm not saying monetary growth and monetary inequality is better and therefore ignore PPP. You have to say, let's study all three. You have to use what I call data pluralism. We have to ask very simply, since they're different, what explains the difference? And actually, that's almost an undergraduate question. This graph here shows the gap between the real output of the South and the real output of the North. And it's systematically higher. Only where it falls below 0% is the growth rate of the South lower than the growth rate of the North. Everywhere else it's higher. And it's getting greater, so that it's since 2000, it's been catching up with the North in real terms by up to 4%. But the effect on its monetary income, particularly before 2000, is not the same. So how can you get more unequal in money terms when you're getting less unequal in real terms? It's very simple. How can monetary income fall when real output rises? And as I say, it's a first year undergraduate question. It's because the price of what the South sells is falling, and the price of what the North sells is rising. And that's because the North has a monopoly of high-tech goods, and the South has been relegated by the effects of the neoliberal era to a provider of cheap labor goods, crops, and minerals. It's the old colonial division of the world has simply been reproduced under a different political order. And I'm going to finish with one graph, which I think is a rather nice one. I'll leave that on the screen. This is a scatter diagram. Every dot is a country. The crosses are the northern countries, and the red circles are the southern ones. The date is 1996, peak of the neoliberal era. Along this axis, we have the price level. So the more money you get for your goods, the further you are up this line. The richer you are, further up you are on that line. And the world is basically divided into 4 quadrants. And all the North quadrant, all the North countries are in the high income, high price level quadrant. And all the South countries are in the low income, low price level quadrant. I rest my case. I'm done. Very hard to see if anybody was actually listening, but I hope so. Maybe nobody was listening. No, good. Hi.
Hi, Sarah. I think you had finished. Well, as if you finished, so for right now, as we didn't receive any question from
no question
from the channels, when the question comes, we will transfer it to you. Thank you, sir, for this good knowledge that you shared with us, sir. And I will give Mrs. Sema can say 1 or 2 words.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor.
Okay. Thank you.
Hope to see you in Turkey.
Oh, I hope to be in Turkey as soon as this pandemic is over. I'm hightailing it for Turkey.